And I think the angle that you're bringing to it that's fresh is the magic that you're talking. And I'm curious, it's hard nowadays to talk about magic in a fictional context without bringing up, say, J.K. Rowling.
Right.
She sold a few books about magic.
One or two, I heard, yeah.
And
I've heard these books described as like Harry Potter meets George Washington, which is what somebody said. So I don't have any problem with that.
Well, I'm interested. I think it's partially because of the need for secrecy about magic in the book that dictates part of what I'm going to ask. But you know, your use of magic or the magic in your book seems to have a less pragmatic or workaday air than sort of the magic in J.K. Rowling, where in J.K. Rowling they use it to make dinner. Right? They use it to enchant cars that fly and things like this, things that have these really pragmatic bends. And all of the witchcraft seems to be much more of a mysterious way of application, almost as if you see magic in a more principled but a different metaphysical error than J.K. Rowling. I'm interested in...
No, that's a great question and a great observation. I think Rowling's success is because she takes all these elements of magic and makes them part of or an outgrowth of the consumer culture that we live in today. That's why people came to her books and they felt new and they felt like a reflection of our world because she was able to bring those things together. So people are, excited about getting the latest kind of magic broom the same way we would be about getting a new car or a new motorcycle, something like that. And I think that's part of her particular brilliance. But I wanted the magic that my characters used to grow out of their period. So I really spent a lot of time reading about folk magic at the time, looking at the kinds of spells and things that were done, or the kinds of witchcraft that the kinds of spells that witches were alleged to do at that time, and drawing on that and making it real. And I think that it's an outgrowth of a very different worldview in which the physical or the material world and the spiritual world are not only coexistent with each other, but sometimes in conflict with each other. And so if you've read the second book and the third book, you know that gets more pronounced and developed, this gap between the spiritual world and the physical world as the series progresses, and the stakes get higher for the characters as a result. So I tried to let it grow organically out of the way they looked at witchcraft at the time, and part of that is the use of Bible verses and Christian spells. Christian witches at the time saw themselves as both Christian and users of magic. The idea that magic is just a miracle by another name, that it comes from God or comes from heaven, is something that some of the characters in these books, I think, strongly believe. And I tried to develop a system of magic that grew out of those beliefs.
So the thing that I thought was interesting is the good magic seems mostly to exist to be able to break up the bad magic, but doesn't seem to exploit or have its own sort of inherent power in the way that it reminded me of Star Wars, where Darth Vader always seems so much more powerful than anybody else. It was that
part of that, I think, is just the act of moral conscience. I think that when you are concerned about others or concerned about the use of power, you're more reluctant to use power. And so part of the tradition in here of witchcraft comes out of the Quaker tradition. Deborah Walcott and her mother and her family are Quakers. They're pacifists. They believe in the light and in kind of this respect for people and for the use of power. And I think that when you want to have power over other people, when you want to control them for your own benefit, you don't have that set of brakes, on you to slow you down. And so I think that's a big difference between the good guys and the bad guys, not just in this story, but in a lot of stories.
Okay. And if we come back to Proctor Brown, the main character, he's got moments when he seems like he doesn't behave quite like the hero you might expect in a fantasy novel. He reacts rashly at times, and isn't always sticking around to catch the consequences of his rash actions. I'm curious about...
Were you 20 years old once?
I was completely rational at the time. But yeah, I was curious about that because a lot of times you get in fantasy literature, you can get a lot more cardboard sort of characters where I'm going to do what's perfectly right, Dudley, do right, you know, sort of characters. And he doesn't do that. And there's a couple of times when, you know, you show these real struggles he's got over whether or not he's going to act in the face of danger.
I think that you know, he's confronted here with circumstances and situations that he hasn't experienced before, both on the witchcraft side and on just the aspect of war. And he's in doubt, as many young men were, as to what he was going to do or how he was going to respond. And so sometimes he acts too quickly, and sometimes he waits too long, and you know, withholds information or doesn't speak when he should. And I just think that that's part of making mistakes, is part of being that age, part of coming to something that's new. And I think the mark of his character then is not, you know, where he starts, but where he ends up. How does he grow from the beginning of his story, right at the Battle of Lexington and Bunker Hill, over the course of years till he arrives, you know, with Washington's army and Cornwallis at Yorktown at the end of the third book. And I think that's the interesting arc of his character.
Okay. What kinds of information were you able to find about witchcraft at this time? You mentioned some of it earlier. How specific do they get, and do you have any really good spells that you could share with us?
That would be wrong.
That would be, there's that moral conscience again. I was hoping to draw in listeners and viewers, that kind of spell.
The main, I think a lot of the spells and things that are published at this time come out of Europe. There's not as many materials in America. In America, most of the magic is folk magic, and it's there to cure your cow from sickness or to make somebody, you know, fall down and break a leg. They're much smaller items. But the tradition in Europe is much larger, and there are large grimoires published with grimoire is a book of spells or a book of magic. And so there are everything from how to speak to the dead to how to raise the dead, to communicate with angels, to make yourself invulnerable to harm from bullets. The list of spells and kinds of spells goes on and was very specific. And I would go through them and kind of cherry pick what I wanted to use for the stories or the things that I thought the characters would know.
Okay. Your author, but now this is a much more disturbing question. Your author bio on the book says you were born in New York, but, quote, banished to rural Ohio as a child. And a character in your book volunteers to go to a farm to learn witchcraft because, in part, quote, anything's better than going to Ohio. Yep. So I have to ask, what's your problem with Ohio? Why does it come in for such abuse in these texts?
I love Ohio. Those are actually both in jokes. I was born in New York City. My mom moved back to Marysville, Ohio when I was very small, and that's where I grew up. And I think as a young person, I was going, wow, I'm stuck here in this little town. At that time, it was very small, and New York seemed so big and fabulous in comparison. And my wife is from California, Ray Carson Finlay, and she just moved out from California to marry me a couple of years ago, and she's not adjusting well from California to Ohio all the time. I think the change in weather and circumstances has been a big difference for her, and so that
was a change in weather.
She's winter, the months of gray and wet, has been a difficult adjustment for her. So I think that line was for her, and she got a strong kick out of it when I wrote it.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll let it go.
I'm happy to take the challenges, but I love Ohio, and the new books that I'm working on, the Civil War novel that picks up the story of the witches and carries it through the Civil War, starts out in Ohio with the Underground Railroad. So maybe I'll have a chance to redeem myself.